It is great to be here. The most basic question I have to ask you today is, how much did Steve Patrick have to pay you to come this afternoon? I'm really grateful that you're here. It's a beautiful day. I just went for a walk. I know many of you probably wanted to take the afternoon off, so I'm really grateful you're here. And I'm also reminded at this time slot, I'm the only one standing between you and a drink. And it reminds me of the old adage, which is, have a really strong intro, a really good conclusion, and leave as little room as possible in between. But, the fact is, I hope that you'll indulge me for a few minutes to talk about where we are as a country, why collective impact is so important right now, and what it will take to make sure that we put community in collective impact as we move forward. As I travel around the country, what I hear over and over again from Americans is that this country is not on the right track, that we can do better, that we can be better. I hear Americans saying enough is enough. It seems to me that we're increasingly approaching an inflection point in this country where we're going to have a fundamental choice to make. A choice between continuing down the path of the status quo, which only breeds skepticism and cynicism and a sense of false hope, or blazing a new path filled with possibility and hope that will take hard work. I think Americans right now are yearning to come out from their homes to re-engage and reconnect with one another to build this new path. We're builders after all in our country. It's part of our DNA. It's part of our character. After all, the American Revolution was about building a new country. After the Civil War, when we abolished slavery, we had to rebuild. We remained builders when we passed child labor laws, women's suffrage, civil rights, voting rights. People in our communities are builders every day, toiling away in their church basements, working in schools, trying to make a better community for themselves, their neighbors, and their families. We're builders. My question today for us is, what will collective impact build on? It seems to me collective impact offers us the opportunity to build together, But what will we build on? We've clearly placed a stake in the ground around data. We clearly placed a stake in the ground around using evidence-based decision-making, about using best practices. These are all vital. I'm a huge proponent of each of them and all of them. But it seems to me that on their own, they will not be sufficient to make collective impact successful in our country and to help us blaze this new path. It seems to me that what we also need to build on is community. We need to remind ourselves that community in this country is a common enterprise filled with shared responsibility, where we come together and make decisions together about the directions we want to move our communities in that are important to us and vital to our lives. It's part of the American idea. It's part of the American experience. And so today what I'd like to talk about for a few minutes is what it will take to build on community. And I'd like to focus on 5 characteristics of civic culture. I think of these as sort of the flip side of the coin of the 5 pillars or 5 elements of collective impact. That those tell us how to do things. The 5 characteristics of civic culture tell us how we need to engage with our communities in order to make sure that we actually create the success and fulfill the pledges and promises that we're making to our communities. But before I talk about those 5 things, there's something else I want to talk about first. It's a fundamental choice that each of us has to make personally. We can't send it out for someone else to make for us. And that is whether or not we will turn outward toward our communities or be turned inward toward ourselves. Turning outward is an orientation, a disposition, a way of thinking about what we're doing. It's fundamentally about the direction that we're facing. Are we facing out toward our community or inward toward ourselves? It seems to me we have a fundamental choice to make about whether or not the community will be our reference point for the work we do, or whether or not our conference rooms will be the reference point for the work we do. Many Americans tell me that too many of us as individuals are turned inward. We're focused on what we want, when we want it. If we don't like what we get, we expect to be able to return it. We're obsessed with instant gratification, Americans tell me. But our organizations also, what I find, too many of our organizations doing work in communities are turned inward. We're more concerned about our own survival. We're more concerned about getting credit for what's been done. We're more concerned about being in front of the parade. We're more concerned about getting on the front page of the newspaper. We're more concerned about getting that 2-minute segment on the nightly news. We're turned inward toward ourselves, focused on our own programs, our own initiatives, and sometimes our own collective impact efforts, right? And what we find in communities right now, the thing that troubles me, that I think we need to combat, and why I'm so happy to be here today, is that the more we find that organizations want to become relevant and significant in the life of the community, the more we find they turn inward. They think that in order to be more significant and impactful in their communities, all they need to do is another strategic plan. All they need to do is reorganize their collaborative. All they need to do at times is to develop a new logo, right? And think that somehow or another, because we're more attractive, we're more effective. But we know that's not the case. We know that's not the case. It seems to me, if we want to build collective impact on communities, if communities are the place where collective impact takes place, then the first order of business for us is to make sure that we have become turned outward toward our communities, where we're focused more on action than activity, focused less on inputs and more on impact, focused less on public relations and more on thinking about people's reality, focused less on process and becoming entangled in it, and more on making sure that we're developing progress for the communities that we're working for. And so once we're turned outward, it seems to me that there are 5 characteristics of civic culture that we need to act on if we want to put community in collective impact. These are the 5 levers I think we need to focus on. There are others. But if somehow we could focus on these 5, I think we'd make a lot of progress. The first one is this. It deals with community ownership. Community ownership, and this was raised in the lunch session today. We build common agendas, but whose agendas are they? Are they the agendas of our organizations, or are they the agendas of the community itself? And it seems to me that if we want to build in our communities, we have to concern ourselves with what does it take to build public will for change across our communities? What does it take to understand what the authentic demand is for change in our communities? What is it that people are really concerned about? What matters to them? And what matters to us collectively in our communities? And in the 30 years I've been doing this work, the only way I know to figure out the answers to these questions is to authentically engage our communities and ask them. But the challenge is when we engage our communities, we tend to make one of 3 mistakes. One is we go out and we ask people what the problems are in their community, right? And lo and behold, before we know it, people are complaining about why more progress hasn't been made. They're starting to point fingers at one another, casting aspersions. We're looking to figure out who's to blame for why we haven't made more progress. And before you know it, our conversations in our communities are starting to reflect the kind of toxic, divisive, acrimonious discourse that we're trying to get away from. When we don't do that, we decide, well, we'll take a more proactive point of view on this. And so we undertake a visioning exercise. Any of you been involved in those with the little yellow dots? All right? And the facilitator is saying, don't talk too much. Don't talk too much. Just put your dots up so we can count them. Except you can't generate public will by counting dots. You can't figure out what people share by simply counting dots, because we can't figure out where the points of transcendence are, what it is that people really value, what it is that they really want. And have you ever noticed, by the way, what happens to those visioning exercises after they're done? I hope I'm not insulting anyone here. I know there's some good, I know there are some good visioning exercises, but there are a hell of a lot bad ones, a hell of a lot more bad ones. Have you ever noticed what happens to those visioning exercises when they gather up all the data and they print them in 4 colors on glossy paper and saddle stitch them? And there are 130 recommendations and 700 subgroups are going to work on these. Those reports just sit at the bottom of our piles. They're filed away in our file drawers. And the reason why, the number one reason why I think, is because those visioning exercises are untethered from our reality. We're asked simply to blue sky, to think about the type of community we want that bears no relationship to the reality in which we live. And when people look at it, they can't see themselves in it. They can't hear themselves, and they can't figure out how in God's name are we going to create a pathway to achieve this vision, which seems to bear little relationship to the reality I live in. And so I want to offer you an alternative if, in fact, we want to authentically engage our communities and understand what kind of public will exists, what really matters to people, the direction they really want to go in their community, and what would help develop a common agenda that the community can own, that the community own. It seems to me that we've got to focus on people's shared aspirations, their shared aspirations. And we have to ask people the question, what are your aspirations for our community? Not your community, our community. And I urge you to go do this tonight over dinner or over drinks or when you go home or call someone up on the phone. And what you'll recognize when you ask someone about their aspirations for their community is that it always begins with their reality and moves to where they want to go. It's never untethered from their reality because it holds meaning for what they want to achieve in their lives and what we want to achieve together. When people start talking about their shared aspirations in a community, what happens all of a sudden is they start to realize, no, we're not going to agree on everything. But notwithstanding or despite what the news media tells us, we can agree on a lot of things in this community. And there are things that we can work on together and build together. When people start talking about their shared aspirations, all of a sudden they recognize that no matter how good our organizations are in our communities, no matter how much they work collectively, we as citizens are going to have to play a role in achieving these aspirations. Right? We as citizens are going to have to play a role in achieving these aspirations. All of a sudden, people realize that there's a common language we can start to speak in our community and a common direction that we can start to move in. When we find out these shared aspirations, we can talk to people about the challenges they face in reaching those aspirations. Because after all, what they want to do is move forward, not stay where they are. And when we figure that out, we can start to talk to them about who they trust to help us do that. Who they trust to help us do that. It seems to me this kind of knowledge, which only people in our communities can provide us, is critical to developing a common agenda that will enjoy community ownership and a sense of public will and people willing to work for it and be for it and to come out of their homes and join together to work at it. Now, there's a simple test I give people when we're working with them in communities, and it goes something like this. If I followed you to one of your communities, and I brought you into a room like this, and there were 200, 300 people in the room from across your community, and I took you to the center of the room, table 12, raise your hand, table 12, there you go. And I took you to the center of the room and I asked you to climb up on that table, stand up on it. And I asked you to look into the eyes of people from your community, cross-section of folks from your town. And I said to you, you're not allowed to talk about your collective impact project. You're not allowed to talk about your funders or investors. You're not allowed to talk about how many organizations you've aligned or how many funders you've aligned. You're not allowed to talk about your shared measurements. The only thing you're allowed to do is to look into the eyes of the people in this room and reflect back to them their shared aspirations for this community. Could you do it? If I asked you to stand up on that table and reflect back to people the challenges that they experience in trying to reach these shared aspirations, could you do it? If I asked you to look into their eyes and to reflect back and explain to them their lived experiences, not the experiences we read about in reports or look at through data, but people's lived experiences in terms of these challenges and trying to reach these shared aspirations, could you do it? It seems to me that if we want real community ownership, if we want a common agenda that reflects what people care about, then we've got to be able to stand up on this table and reflect back to people what we know about their community, about our community. Still with me? Okay, number two. Number two. We need to think about strategies that fit our local context. And we've talked a lot about this over the last day and a half. But I want to talk about a special part of it. At the Institute, we've been wrestling with questions about why is it that some communities move forward and others don't? Why is it that some initiatives, collective impact efforts, and other initiatives, why is it that some work in some communities and not in others? And what we've found in looking at this question over the last 25 to 30 years is that communities go through stages, and there are 5 of them. These are community stages, not collective impact stages, right? Communities go through 5 stages, and each stage is different, and what we've discovered is the strategies that we deploy in each stage is fundamentally different too. The ways in which we go about creating change, how fast or how slow we can create change, about the kinds of expectations, we talked about this at lunch, right? The kinds of expectations that are realistic to set, even if they're stretch goals, that are realistic to set given the stage that we're in, about what it actually takes to build momentum in a community and a sense of possibility that we're actually moving down a path of hope and possibility. There are 5 of these stages. If you're in the impasse stage, what we've discovered, which is one of the first stages, let me just say before I say that, in doing this work, what I found in these 5 stages is that the vast majority, maybe 80% of the communities that I've worked in over 30 years are in one of the first 2.5 stages. In the first 2.5 stages, most communities are resistant to change. They don't have the norms, the relationships, the leaders that people trust, the organizations that people believe can be engines of change. And so the question is, if your community is in one of those, the first stage, the waiting place, the second stage, impasse, the third stage, catalytic, then the fourth stage is growth, and the fifth is sustain and renew. If you're in waiting place or impasse or the first part of catalytic, your community is resistant to change. So if you're in impasse, which a lot of communities are in, what you'll hear if you go to that community is people saying, enough is enough, we can't go on like this any longer. And what you'll hear is some common agreement about what the problems are and what the challenges are in the community. But the mistake that we always make is we take that agreement about the challenge and assume that people agree on the solution. And in the impasse stage, they seldom do. They seldom do. In fact, in the impasse stage, it's very hard to get people to have productive conversations. It's hard to get leaders around the table who will work together. It's hard to get organizations to turn outward and work on behalf of the community. And so if your community is in impasse, you would have to think about what is the strategy we could start to do in collective impact that would enable us to actually get traction and win and be successful so that people would gain a sense of hope and possibility that we should keep moving. Remember, we talked about, Stacy Stewart talked about this, Stacy and I have talked about this a lot, the notion of civic confidence. And what we find is that this confidence comes from our ability to calibrate which stage we're in and to develop the right strategies for moving forward in that stage. And so this becomes pivotal in terms of thinking about how we develop our strategies, how we set metrics and shared measurements, how we think about evaluation, how we think about the expectations, or let me put it this way, the pledges and promises we're going to make to a community. And remember, this is at a time when people are skeptical and cynical about change in our country. And so the pledges and promises we make and how realistic they are and our ability to achieve them becomes mightily important right now. Third.
Rich, can you do the 5 again before you segue, just so we all have
Yeah, no problem. Let's see if I can remember. Waiting place. So I'll do these real quick. Waiting place. You ever read the book, All the Places You'll Go? Waiting for a plane. You know something's wrong, but you're waiting for a plane, you're waiting for a train, right? You have an inkling that something's wrong. There's kind of what the philosopher Isaiah Berlin would call a felt unknown. You can't quite define it. So if you're in the waiting place and you try to create strong change, you will gain very little traction because there's no sense of urgency to produce change. Impasse. The difference between impasse and the waiting place is the sense of urgency has arisen. People are saying enough is enough. There's agreement on the challenge, but no agreement on solutions. And you don't have the capacity and the trust and the relationships to make big change go. The question becomes, what do you peel off collectively to start to get the collective impact path going? Third stage, catalytic. Think of this as the stage of innovation. This is where pockets of change start to bubble up, And the question is, how can you spread them across a community over time and start to connect them? The kiss of death in catalytic is coordinating these activities too quickly because you'll kill innovation and creativity. And so there the question becomes for collective impact is, how do we nurture these pockets and connect them over time, but do it in such a way that supports them and grows them, as opposed to killing them and strangling them? I probably shouldn't use that notion here, right? Fourth, growth. You have an abundance of capacity in the community. You have a sense of where you're going, a sense of purpose. This is sort of the ideal stage for collective impact, as well as the second half of catalytic. Here the dilemma is that we tend to rest on our laurels. And the question is, will we address the systemic issues like education, transportation, environment, other issues that we haven't gotten to yet? And then the last stage is sustain and renew. Does that work? These are all on our website. All right. So once you've thought about these strategies, the third is creating a sustainable enabling environment, a sustainable enabling environment. We've talked a lot about this while we were here over the last day and a half. Clearly, collective impact is about outcomes. But my question is, and this goes back to the stages, is how do we create the right enabling environment where change can take root, can grow, and can spread? And without this enabling environment, like if you're in the impasse stage, it's very hard to get change moving. And so what we've figured out at the Institute is there are 9 factors that create this enabling environment in a community. Some of them involve layers of leadership, networks for innovation and learning, organizations that span boundaries and bring people together across dividing lines, norms for interaction, conscious community conversation, a sense of purpose. All of these things help to create this enabling environment that helps to support and grow change in a community. The good news is that we can actually be intentional and create these factors by the way in which we do our work. So in Battle Creek, Michigan, where we're doing collective impact work, what they found there, they're in a stage between impasse and catalytic. And what they figured out in doing this work is that they didn't have enough organized spaces for people to come together and learn about the community together. They didn't have enough organizations who could be engines of change. And they didn't have enough diverse leadership to actually lead the change that people would trust. And so here's the trick about creating this enabling environment. It's what we call the sweet spot of public life. Think about a Venn diagram. On the left-hand side is a circle that's the issue you're trying to move the needle on. And the right-hand circle is conditions of community, this enabling environment. In the middle is the sweet spot. And the thing is that if we have enough discipline and we work with enough intentionality, we can actually move the needle on issues while we're simultaneously building this enabling environment. And that's where we see communities accelerate the most through these 5 stages that I was just talking about. Okay, fourth. Fourth deals with impact and belief. Impact and belief. You know, I took a walk across the country a couple of years ago and talked to Americans about their lives, their concerns, their aspirations, what's happening with the country. This was right on the heels of the Great Recession. I spent a year doing this, among other things. And as I was talking to folks, they talked about the fact that many of their homes were underwater. They talked about the fact that for many of them, one parent or both parents had lost their jobs. Many talked about the fact that they had to pull their kid out of community college because they could no longer pay the tuition. But you know what the #1 issue people told me the country faces right now? Even more important than the fact that their homes might be underwater or they feel like the rules are rigged against the middle class. It was their belief that we need to restore our belief in ourselves and one another, that we can come together and get things done. It was a sense that we could come out from our homes and start to join together and set goals together. It was that we could start to set these goals and work toward these goals together. It was that when we made a mistake and fell down and essentially scraped our knee, we had the wherewithal, the courage, the fortitude to get up and sort of brush ourselves off and keep going. That when we did that, when we achieved something, we could celebrate our victories and actually demonstrate that we could do something. What people were telling me over and over again is our first order of business in this country right now is to restore a sense of trust between and among us. It's to reinvigorate meaningful relationships in our community. And it's to expand and deepen our confidence that we can actually work together on a common agenda and get things done. Impact is often demonstrated through numbers, and those numbers are vital. They're important. I wouldn't want to do away with them. But think about in your own life about how belief is generated and what it takes. In community life, what it takes is people believing that they're part of something larger than themselves. That people believe and can see that we can actually come together and join hands and lock arms and move forward together. It's that there's room for people to come back into the community and start to work together and make a difference. I think this notion of belief for collective impact is vitally important. And I dare to say this standing here before you today, but I don't think all the impact in the world alone will restore people's belief in themselves and in one another in this country. They're looking for something bigger, a broader context about how we relate to each other, about how their lives are lived, about whether or not we can have confidence in our communities to move forward, about whether or not these are the communities we want to raise our children in or retire in. And those things come from how we relate to each other and work together, and whether or not in our collective impact designs, we actually make room for ordinary folks to come together and do things to move their community forward, or whether or not collective impact will be a process governed and driven solely by organizations. I think it's a fundamental choice that we have to come to grips with if we want to move our communities forward. Last point. Last point deals with the stories we tell ourselves about our community. What I've come to understand is that the narratives of our community are the most important hidden factor in whether or not communities move forward or not. The stories we tell each other. They shape our mindset in our communities. They shape our attitudes. They shape our behaviors and actions. They shape what we do and how we feel about ourselves and the places where we live. I was working in a community in Ohio on education reform, and the narrative there among parents and adults was all our kids can't learn, is what they told us. We don't believe we should invest in them. We think they're up to no good, and most of them are going to end up on welfare anyway. That was the narrative that they told about their kids at a time when they were trying to raise educational expectations for their children in this community. When we talked to students in that community, after about an hour of talking with them, they said, I bet you we can tell you what they say about us. We're all up to no good. We don't have the potential to learn. Most of us are going to be crooks. A lot of us are going to end up on welfare. Now I ask you, if that's the narrative of a community, what makes us believe that any action we take will reshape how people engage in that community, whether or not those kids on a dark night in the winter will stand on a cold corner waiting for a school bus to go to a school where they don't believe the adults believe in them? Now that may not be the narrative in your community, but there are other narratives. The narratives of change can't happen here, we already tried that, right? The narrative of I'm waiting for the next mayor to get elected. Or the narrative in Vegas. Is anyone here from Vegas? Good. When I was working in Vegas at the height of their economic boom, their narrative was, catch this, I'm for me and you're for me. I'm for me and you're for me. Now, the question is, if we have some of these ingrained narratives in our community, or another community is, everything is fine here, right? A lot of communities are like that. If these are the narratives of your community, the question is, how do you create a can-do narrative that can help motivate a community to move forward and help inspire people to come out and work together? Now, whenever I say this, people say, well, we already hired a public relations consultant, we're all set. And what I would say to you is Americans have been sold so many bills of goods that they don't want to hear more PR that gloss over what's really happening in their community. Then we say, well, if we don't hire the PR firm, we'll hire a firm that can help us tell stories in our community. You know, the stories, the feel-good stories about how a couple people got together and saved a cat from a burning building, right? But the fact is, in so many of our communities now, we're inundated with these stories, and they're creating more confusion and less coherence about where we are and where we're going. And so it seems to me we need to do two things. One is we need to learn to tell a different kind of story, what I would call a civic parable. You remember the parable about the Good Samaritan, right? The guy gets robbed, a Levite passes by, a priest passes by, and finally the Samaritan comes along and helps the individual up. And if you ever remember about that parable, the implication is always, will you do that yourself the next time you find someone on a street or in need? It seems to me that we need to learn to tell civic parables about how our community is starting to move forward, how people are coming together, how they've set goals together, like I was talking about before, how they encountered certain challenges and decided that they could take a different path. We need to tell stories that people can see themselves in and relate to. And then the second thing we need to do after we gain these civic parables is we need to connect them into a new narrative, a can-do narrative. And as you move through these stages, what you'll find is that ultimately this can-do narrative comes into competition with the existing ingrained narrative. And our job is to help spread this new can-do narrative in a community in a way that is authentic, in a way in which people can see themselves in a way in which people can see that if we actually come together, we can create change together. You know, there's an old country song, the refrain of which is, I can't see me in your eyes anymore. And I think what people are looking for now when they look out into public life, not just individuals, but nonprofits and other groups, is can we see ourselves? Do we hear ourselves? Do we believe that our experiences are reflected in what's happening in our community and in the efforts that we're making to improve our community? We don't need more stories about how heroic an organization has been. We need more stories about how people in a community got together and created change and demonstrated that it's worthwhile to have some semblance of hope and possibility in their communities. So let me just close with this. We all remember Newtown, Connecticut. About a year and a half ago, a 19-year-old gunman named Adam Lanza walked into the Sandy Hook Elementary School and massacred 20 first graders and 6 adults. Some few weeks after that massacre occurred, I got a phone call from the first selectman, essentially the mayor of Newtown, asking me whether or not I would design and lead a process by which that community would make a decision about what to do with the Sandy Hook Elementary School. So I went up there and agreed to do it. And what I discovered pretty quickly was that as much as this was about what to do with this school, it was really about whether or not a community could pivot from trauma and despair to a sense of healing and hope. To a sense of healing and hope. The mayor had set up a task force of 28 elected officials from 4 different governing boards who had never worked together and were largely rivals. It was a setup or a recipe for a lot of grandstanding and people pursuing their own points of view about what should happen. In fact, many people believe we shouldn't even be talking about this. We should have waited a full year before we talked about what to do with this school building. But we decided to move on. At times it looked like the process would break down and the news media would call me and say, you see, we told you it would break down. We knew that a community could never make a decision about this. Ultimately, the community did come together, and they didn't make a decision 2/3 versus 1/3 or 50-50. It was a unanimous decision to raise the building and build anew. But here's what I want to leave you with. The first time I went up to Newtown, I flew up from Washington, D.C., where I lived, to Hartford, Connecticut, and I drove 45 minutes or so to Newtown. And I drove up to the town hall, which is a single-story building. Newtown's a small town, 27,000 folks. And I walked into the building, and to the right was the mayor's office and the council chambers where we would come to hold all our meetings in public with the news media and hundreds of people surrounding us. To the left was a glass wall that had two signs on it. The first sign was a green sign with a white border, which I now have in my office, which read, "We are Sandy Hook, we choose love." The second sign was a white sign with a green border, which I also have in my office, which read, "Our collective strength and resilience will be an example to the rest of the world." Our collective strength and resilience will be an example to the rest of the world. I've continued to work and keep in touch with the folks in Newtown, and I believe they are an example to the rest of the world about how a community deals with inexplicable trauma and despair and moves to a sense of healing and hope. But here's my dream. My dream is that your community has that second sign, our collective strength and resilience will be an example to this world, that sign hangs in your city hall or town hall. My hope is that sign hangs in your public library, that sign hangs in your grocery stores as it does in Newtown, that it hangs in your laundromats, that it's on street signs, that people in your community begin to see that your community and its collective strength and resilience maybe isn't an example to the rest of the world, but is surely an example to itself and to neighboring communities. And it might prompt the imagination and the wherewithal and the fortitude and the courage for others to step forward and create similar kind of change. It seems to me right now we face a fundamental choice. Will we stay on the path of the status quo, of skepticism and cynicism and change at the margins? Or will we choose the other path, to blaze a new path of hope and possibility? And I believe collective impact, and the reason why I'm here today, is collective impact can help us lead that way and bring people together to create the change that we want to do and restore our sense of hope and belief. But it's going to take that we turn outward. It's going to take that we put community in collective impact. And it's going to take that we reclaim being builders again in this country. Thanks so much.